complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like,
If you share my lack of faith in our health system, you should take control of your well-being. Building resilience and maintaining good health for the long term needs to be a priority. Axios Remote Fitness Coaching offers one-stop expert advice on training, diet, and lifestyle. You can purchase customized workout plans for strength training or structured exercise. If you're serious about maximizing your potential, you can book time with a coach or customize your routine and get video feedback on your performance. I know the owner, and he's one of us. Visit Axios and support those who support the show. Follow the link in the description to become a man of action with Axios. No one blames you for being weak, but it's your fault if you stay that way.
All right, Dexter La Paz, welcome to the Jay Burton Show. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing very well this evening. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. We have, mutual friends in common. You've appeared on Pete's show a number of times. I recommend those episodes. But if you could you describe, who you are and what you do on the internet?
Well, the pseudonym I go by is Dexter de La Paz. Informed listeners will recognize De La Paz as an homage to Highline's character, Bernardo de La Paz, one of my very first influence. I suppose my quote-unquote internet life got started in libertarian politics. It did not remain there very long. My first love has always been quote-unquote conspiracy theory, and really that's almost all of what I do today. If you already know me from Twitter, you'll know that I refer to myself as the true heir of Art Bell, one of the really notable influences on my life. And I think, in summation, really what I am is a seeker of truth. If it's entertaining along the way, that's good. But I think what's more important is helping people understand just how jacked up our world really is. Things are infinitely weirder and infinitely worse than even I can possibly imagine, but that's also not necessarily an excuse to blackpill about it either.
Well, fair enough. So I'm curious, right? You mentioned that phrase, conspiracy theory. So obviously, if anyone has made it this far, they've kind of accepted that premise, that all you've been told is not true. So when you say that phrase, conspiracy theory, what do you mean by it?
I mean that it should be evident to you and I, and hopefully to anyone listening, that there are groups of individuals in the world, or even just single individuals themselves, who have sufficient power, influence, physical wealth, assets, and soft power to make machinery of government and state actors or state level non state actors move for them and to their own ends, and that these people, whoever they may be, because I don't think we know nearly as many of them as many of us think we do, they make the state and non state actors move to their whim and many times radically re engineer or reshape society and nations as we understand them to their own benefit, whether that be a materialist paradigm of even more wealth, even more land, even more possessions, or more metaphysically trying to promote viewpoints that they want to see promulgated in the world. And I suppose what I'm saying by conspiracy theory is the study of these individuals and their actions and making sure that these actions remain within public view. Does that answer the question?
No, it does very, very neatly. So what I want to talk with you about is actually quite specific. Conspiracy theory is quite a general topic, but it is a specific event. So I'm a young guy, right? I'm 24 years old. I'm a Zoomer. So this is not something that I experienced firsthand. But one of the kind of like hallmarks of, shall we say, like mainline liberal in the most, general sense narrative is this idea of the satanic panic, which according to the meme, right, the cultural idea, basically a bunch of out of touch, probably racist, ignorant Southerners got it in their head that daycare workers were possessed by the devil and were molesting children. And then somehow there was rock and roll music and Dungeons and Dragons thrown in. And it's kind of associated with people like Jack Chick. So almost nothing to it. And obviously, we can admit, you and I, that maybe playing rock and roll backwards wasn't the way to summon the devil, and Dungeons and Dragons doesn't seem to have created a portal to hell. But I assume there was something more to it. So if you could you describe, very briefly, the kind of insider's take on the Satanic Panic?
So, to give this as bird's eye as we can, just to get started, you're correct in your assessment in that the Satanic Panic is a term that is used in a derogatory sense to talk about the various daycare scandals of the very late 70s, primarily the 80s, and the very early 90s. It was used to deride cultural concerns, as you said, about subversive or countercultural influences that arose after the hippie movement. And it was really sort of, as you said, primarily an evangelical thing. The greatest generation and the oldest of the boomers were starting to have their own kids. They were freaking out. They didn't know how to handle these things. There was genuinely a lack of sort of critical thinking, I guess, around why those cultural influences were arising and why these things were popular. Now, at the same time as all of that, while all of that's going on, you also had, as you said, these daycare panics, where these same people who were failing to understand how these things were arising in youth culture were also obsessed with the potential of child abuse scandals. Now, where all of this gets very interesting is that while all of that was going on, there was also ongoing Iran Contra, which, as you may know, as listeners may know, was a U.S. selling guns to opponent regimes and funneling the money back to South American terrorists that the American regime was supporting at the time, and the savings and loan crisis, in which small banks, credit unions, insurance companies all started collapsing throughout the US. And we'll get into that later, but all of these things are tied together. And suffice to say that for as many of these daycare abuse scandals that were in fact provably hoaxes, a number of them weren't. And furthermore, a number of them, there may be more to the story than the public record is continuing to show. And so you've got this sort of cultural reactionary force arising from the evangelical bloc while it was at its height of power. You've got rampant money laundering. You've got real and alleged child abuse happening across the nation and really even across the world. And you've got CIA spook glowy activity also rampant across the world. And all this is kind of going on throughout the entirety of the Reagan and Elder Bush regime, primarily, though, of course, these things have also happened through all of American history.
All right, so let's start with sort of the outside layer of the onion. So, what's an example of kind of the most easily disprovable examples, specifically when it comes to daycare sex scandal?
Well, the easiest ones, of course, are instances where the stuff just absolutely didn't happen. There's examples like Fell Acres Day School, that was in Massachusetts. There were 3, 4 allegations there, and they ended up just being provably false. Gosh, what are some of the other big ones that were easily dismissed? Little Rascals, North Carolina, another one that just did not pan out. People got way too worked up. Let's see. There was Kern County, California, which is one that could kind of just go either way, and that's the one that sort of kicked everything off, too. We might have time to get into that later. I don't want to make that one a main thrust, but I would encourage reading up on it for other listeners. And then, really, I want to talk about are the squishy ones that could go either way. And the first one people always think of for that are McMartin, right? And I'm sure even you've heard of that one.
I have, yes.
McMartin, of course, being the preschool out in California, where there was something by the end of it like 70, 80 allegations. The couple running it were accused of various abuses, uh, and the allegations only got more lurid as the trial and the investigation both went on. The trial lasted most of a decade, and by the end of it, we were seeing things like the kids saying that they'd been flushed down a toilet into strange rooms where the people would hurt them, or taken across the country in hot air balloons. And the reason I wanted to talk about this and some of the other wishy washy cases is because child psychology is such a complicated subject. And of course, the obvious possibility that some of them were drugged in the process. So, how do you know when someone's telling the truth? How do you know when their perception's been sufficiently altered that they can't say something or can't articulate what happened to them in a way that gets the point across? And for as much as the left likes to talk about victim blaming, this is an instance where you should take it seriously. When all these people were, I shouldn't say it like that. When you get into investigations like this and you don't, as an adult, know how to comprehend these things, how do you make sense of a lot of that? And that's why the satanic panic is so derided today. You had these victim witnesses talking about how they were abused in such outlandish manners that we couldn't possibly believe them. Well, do we have a duty to believe them? Do we not have a duty to believe them? And that's what makes this such an interesting but also painfully difficult topic to talk about, because you have to navigate these things where it's certainly impossible to know now, but even in the moment was virtually impossible to sort out.
So I'm curious, right? Especially in a post Me Too world, why do you think that the messaging about the satanic panic is entirely, it's all smoke and mirrors, it was all mass psychosis? Why do you think that it's remembered that way? Was it just the people who promoted it are kind of, shall we say, regime enemies, or is there, a deeper meaning?
Well, I think the reason that all of this worked out the way it did was because it was clearly in the interest of those individuals and those groups that I addressed with my definition of conspiracy theory in the beginning to keep these things hidden and obscured as they were able to, specifically when it impacts either their financial or their other metaphysical is the word I'm going to keep using. It's not the best word, but it works in that people get my point. Contexts, right? So they lean on these newspapers to make these stories as outlandish and as insane as possible. And while doing so, they can also use this as an opportunity to break what is typically, but not always, an enemy power block, which is to say, in this context, the evangelicals. And so you really have all these incentives structured as such that you want to make these people sound as unhinged and as worried about nothing as possible. And so what you then do is you make it about show trials. You see other agents of the people, of the perpetrators, doing what they can to damage legal proceedings, to wage social warfare on both the victims and the people attempting to act on the victims' behalf. You see things like I don't know, what we were talking about. Instances where Dungeons and Dragons concerns, obviously silly, being promoted as the height of this satanic panic issue, the whole rock and roll backwards summoning the devil. It became a smear campaign to make the opponents of what was happening, the people defending these victims, sound as absurd as possible. And really, that's what it is. It's newspaper warfare, ultimately. But the mind of the normie is such, especially the liberal normie, and especially in our age, that when we look back at it now, these are just the basic cultural assumptions. Obviously, these people were crazy.
Well, and that's sort of an interesting, sort of an interesting angle. Is that if you study how power works, if you study how the people in power stay there, one of the things that you'll notice very quickly is that they're incredibly adept at sort of narrative judo, right? Which is that no matter what event happens, because you'd assume, right, from a certain perspective that like, oh, there's something fishy going on. People would want to investigate this. But the control that the regime has over media is so, at least it was at the day, so intense that even that can be used as a, redirected, right? That energy can be used to punish their enemies. And I think it's kind of an interesting example of that, if nothing else. So I know that you want to talk about this at, kind of the philosophical level, and I want to as well. But you've said a few things that are interesting enough that I feel like we deserve at least some additional context, right? And that specifically has to do with, you mentioned a series of, financial crises. So if you could you describe what those financial crises were and how they're related to this story?
So, what you're talking about is my references to the savings and loans crisis throughout the 80s. And ultimately, what it came down to was, like I said, all these small credit unions and banks and these savings corporations, insurance companies. It'll be blamed on things like banking regulation and Reagan deregulating everything and all of this sort of stuff. But what was actually going on in the background is rampant embezzlement and money laundering. And that is also what you see, and the reason I wanted to bring it up is the setup for the Franklin cover up, which was not necessarily the apex of this crisis, and it's certainly one that's under discussed in the context of the savings and loans crisis due to its prominence rather in the satanic panic paradigm. But you see instances of 40 plus $1 million in 80s dollars just going missing at a drop of a hat when a bank only had $2 million listed on its official real books. And that's also where Iran Contra comes into this. How much of this was spooks washing money through small time banks and then walking away from them when they collapse because gun running takes so much liquid capital that can't just be replaced instantaneously? Though, of course, in some cases it can when you're flipping guns for money for drugs back to guns, which is also how you see things like the crack epidemic developing and rampant cocaine use throughout the 80s that everyone loves to meme them about. And so the reason I brought it up is just because it's relevant to other cases within the satanic panic paradigm. And it should be kept in mind because ultimately that sort of money probably was a prime motivator for a lot of the actors involved in all of these separate things that I've already brought up. What unifies the greedy materialistic mind? Well, it's power. What is power, or how do you attain power? Money, land, soft power, influence. But you need all of these things to make institutions and people move for you, right? What it boils down to is mindset sins like greed and lust and envy. I suppose I don't know if that even really answered the question. I was getting up on my soapbox a little bit there.
No,
Was that
no,
helping the point around?
it does. So to state it more explicitly, do you believe that that these events were okay? Okay, let me ask that as a question. How would you frame all of these events? Do you view them as connected in the sense that it was the same actors or same group of actors? And you've hinted, I guess you've stated quite explicitly that you believe that this was essentially part of, kind of like a move by power, right? Part of the same system that was trading guns and money essentially for power. So why do you think that that is connected to, in some ways, child sexual abuse?
Okay, thank you for phrasing it like that. So, the reason I believe they're all connected is because you see instances like the Presidio Daycare scandal in California in 1986, where Army daycare at the base there has to be shut down because of rampant proven child abuse there. There was 37 children who ended up with STDs as a result of the abuse that was going on there. They ended up managing to pin it on a janitor, but also accused in that whole situation was a name that should be known to many of the people listening if they are conspiracy heads like I am, Michael Aquino. This was a gentleman who ended up leading was it the DNI? One of the various military intelligence agencies, and eventually taking a cabinet level position, in addition to starting the Temple of Set, which was the first recognized Satanist church accepted by the US military.
So that's actually that brings up an interesting point, and this is an aside to the broader point. I'll let you get back to it. But do you consider people like Aquino to be, genuine religious zealots, like Satan's top guy, right? Or do you consider that to essentially be a way to kind of thumb your nose and put your finger in the eye of prevailing morality?
I don't think it terribly makes a difference. Some of them certainly are zealots, and some of them are true believers. I think Aquino specifically, having set up a whole church infrastructure because the Church of Satan wasn't hardcore enough for him, certainly falls into that category. He's the same individual who used the pretext of a government trip, a government funded trip, to go to Germany and try to do a seance to summon up the dead Nazi pagans, in addition to the million and a half other things he did. But perhaps he wasn't a true believer because he was also the author of Mind War, which basically was a document that laid the groundwork for modern US psychological operations and how they'd all go from that point forward, a paradigm shift in propaganda warfare. So some of them certainly are true believers, some of them debatably true believers, and then yet another set of them obviously aren't true believers. They do think they are just indulging their darkest desires however they want with no outside influence. But for believers, of which I am one, we would know that that sort of behavior is in fact exactly what Satan wants from us anyways. That's exactly what the great deceiver wants us to think. Obviously he's not involved.
Well, and Jacob in
Obviously he's
chat,
not, except he is.
right? Well, Jacob in chat brings up a great quote from friend of the show, Aaron McIntyre. There's no such thing as ironic Satanism, which I find myself in agreement with. But anyway, I was interrupting your main stream of thought. So back to the Army daycare and Aquino.
Yes, so you see the Presidio shut down. There's all of these children provably molested, and it's absolutely a moment where, okay, the daycare stories have been rolling for some time now. McMartin is ongoing at that point, and this is a case where it just sort of gets lost in the shuffle of all of the rest of them. And it's not too long after that, two-ish, 2.5 years, that you see Franklin start to kick off. So here's an example of where you've got one of the spookiest guys in US history in the right time, in the right place to be directly involved in this, both as a participant in the abuse potentially. That was disproven in civil court, or rather, he won his case. There was never any criminal referrals. All the caveats you need to not get yourself in trouble. Don't say he did it, but time and place, and also the right position, right? Operating in this sort of spook intelligence paradigm. And so you've already got that as an example. And we know that this was already in their playbook before something like this could have been revealed, because you also have things like the Finders Cult, which is another name that's going to ring familiar for anyone who makes a serious effort of studying conspiracy literature, because those are the same people who were finally busted in the 90s, but began operating in the 50s. And what was their whole deal? Kidnapping and grooming children for intelligence blackmail operations.
So how about you? Because the Finders cult is, I think, one of the most interesting, wells to go down. So if you could you describe what the Founders cult was from kind of the very beginning to when it finally was kind of unveiled, if you could?
So, really, to make it as simple as I can for the uninitiated, what happened was in Virginia, there was this set of proto hippies, beatnik types, who got into the whole communal living thing and the peace on earth and jazz marijuana stuff before it all really took off in the 60s. And being right there next to the centers of US power, it quickly came to the attention of operatives of power that they could take advantage of this and basically cultivate a safe house network using these people who were too stoned to know any better, and the ones who weren't could easily be subverted and made complicit. And so you end up having this structure that's then sheltering a blackmail operation. And as time goes on, the actual hippies are pushed out, and it's used to provide both cover and shelter for operatives who eventually, as I said, begin grooming and running and allegedly selling children. And now all of this is going on in the background until the organization finally formally folds in, I want to say it was 91 or 92. I'm going to have to fact check myself, or if one of the listeners knows the exact date on that, when they were ultimately busted in Florida, in Jacksonville, by local PD with unwashed children in their van. And eventually, in the investigation in that, leads us back to all sorts of stuff from the 70s and on, which seemed to be both the height of CIA involvement with them and also their most nefarious stuff.
Okay, well, fair enough. That's a good place to cover it. And for anyone in the audience who's interested, Martyr Made did kind of I, I- in his Epstein series. I think it's the first or second episode. He covers the Founders Cult at length. So head over there if you're interested, because again, we have limited time. And for I think probably the third time in a row, Paz, I have completely interrupted you. So anyway, back to what we were discussing.
No, that's totally fine. Interrupt when you want to. This is your show. I'm along for the ride here. So, what I was getting at with the finders is you have all these blackmail networks in place, and they're not necessarily explicitly about abusing the children, but you know that that's one of the most effective ways to generate blackmail files, to create leverage. It starts with barely legals, it starts with teens. Then all of a sudden you get someone real high on coke, and all of a sudden they're with a 13-year-old. They've discovered they've got a taste for it, and now that ultra rich lobbyist is coming to you for 9 and 10-year-olds, and you've got a file on them thick as could be, and you can lean on them. It creates leverage networks through getting these people to indulge in greater and greater obvious sins but not just obvious sins, but acts that would be repulsive if revealed. And that's kind of been the story. You referenced Epstein. The Finders Network was kind of the prototype for all of these ones that would follow. And after the founders started to disappear or flounder, you get into things like the Franklin Network. And Epstein really only started to come online after Franklin had to be shut down as a blackmail operation, in addition to whatever else Franklin may have been. And so you see, when you look at it in that context, you see this sort of unbroken chain where various power actors, and more specifically the agents of these actors, are running the same game time and time again, setting it up with different people in different places as soon as one network shuts down, because the ability to create leverage with it is too great to walk away. And obviously, there's moral hazard in contemplating it, let alone doing it. But when you sell your soul for temporal power, it becomes easily worth it. And you talk about selling your soul, in some cases literally, which is where we go back to this paradigm about, are they true believers? Are they just thumbing their nose at the stuck up Christians? And those questions are unanswerable, but indulging in it, ironically or unironically, is still enough to condemn them.
So, one of the questions it seems like we have from chat is basically saying, well, all right, like if this is as widespread as, you allege that it is, and I should say, right, we are alleging all of this. Why are there not people coming forward? Why are there not, survivors of this?
The one I want to go back to, and the one I keep harping on because I think it's the linchpin to understanding how widespread and also how terrible this is Franklin, right? The Franklin cover up, the collapse of the Franklin Credit Union in Omaha. And what that comes down to is when you look at how the trials and the legislative investigations ended up going, there were something like 15 to 20 deaths of either witnesses or investigators. There ended up being 4 people brought before a grand jury to explain just what had happened, as part of the fact finding process that is a grand jury. And I should say 4 victims that came forward. Of those 4, 2 recanted their statements. One of those recants came after the victim's brother was killed, and the only 2 who actually testified in that specific case ended up going to jail for perjury. So you can ask, well, why don't people come forward about this? They do come forward, and the charges are either never pressed, they're dismissed, or in the most egregious cases, the victims are actually the ones who end up punished. And the way this all comes back together, or one of the ways this all comes back together, is that is the common thread through the satanic panic, the daycare abuse, alleged hysteria, the savings and loan collapse, and the spook activity. Even when these people do come forward, how can we make people believe them? Because it's so unreal. When you just can't believe the scale of the evil, how do you persuade people it's really happening? Especially when you must depend on things like a justice system that is so easily compromised by power actors against them. Does that answer
So,
the question, Chet?
I think it does, very neatly. There's an event that you have mentioned several times, and it actually, I think, it might be useful to follow kind of the main character in this story. And that is, you've talked about this bank, right? I believe it's in Omaha, where $40 million disappeared. And if I'm correct, right, the manager of this bank is actually a useful character to examine. Am I correct in that?
I think that it is the most useful case study available to us because it ties in the money, it ties in the pedophile networks, It potentially ties in spook activity, and if nothing else, it also shows how actors at the federal level are willing enough to serve as agents at the hands of perpetrators to shut down effective investigations, even when actors as powerful as state legislators are trying to investigate it.
Well, fair enough. So, how about you go into kind of the specifics of that? Why, like, I know this is a a useful example, but could you kind of walk us through it step by step?
So, as I keep saying, the Franklin Credit Union, excuse me, was a bank in Omaha in the 80s, and it ended up folding in the savings and loan crisis. It went under in 1988 when there was $2 million on their legit books, but a second set of books was discovered that proved more than $40 million had been washed through or embezzled out of there by the manager, one Larry King Jr. Now, the reason this is all roped together is because he was the only alleged perpetrator to actually go down for this, but he never went down for the child abuse. Instead, he went down for financial crimes. He was persecuted as part of the savings and loan crisis. But the problem with that is the fact that it was pretty well known what he was getting up to this whole time from the beginning of the 80s, and obviously probably before then. He was a out and out, not out and out in that he was out of the closet, but he was well known locally as someone who had a strong preference for men, and especially for young boys. And this was known in the community, and this was repeatedly reported. He had cousins who were foster parents and providing children for him. He was picking up children himself, teenagers, using drugs and parties, and he was providing for a network of other local power holders to do the same. And that's how he maintained his local and regional influence. And so, just like with Epstein, before Epstein, and just like with the founders earlier, you see this monster using his own proclivities to cultivate a local power base, whether it was allegedly the chief of the local police, allegedly CEOs of major corporations based in Nebraska, allegedly officials in the FBI. Just assume any other statement I make is going to have the alleged caveat. You've got people in the US Congress because he was well-known associate of Craig Spence, someone who was also running an underage prostitute ring in DC, who killed himself supposedly in Boston. And you have all of these things connected where you have records for social workers, concerned parents, school officials, county sheriffs, all saying that yes, there's rampant abuse going on here. Children are being taken from foster care, from orphanages, from all these places, and being abused by this one guy, and we can point to him. Except for the fact that he's got friends in law enforcement, he's got friends who are the editors of major newspapers, he has protection from the FBI, and so he just keeps getting away with it. And you can't prove any of it if the cops don't investigate. If you're being smeared in the press as the victim, and you run into these issues where, okay, so what do you even do about it? And he doesn't go down until the money becomes involved, because the money is where you can at least look at a ledger and prove something. Even you can smear other victims all you want, but that's at least where there's math involved, and the arithmetic will prove you out.
All right. So, when this guy goes down, right? You said that he went down for what are essentially kind of, routine financial crimes. Does he just disappear from the record after he serves his time?
So, what happens, and in brief here, what happens is as the grand jury is coming up to decide if there's going to be charges in all of this, a judge that is known to be friendly to him issues a court order putting him in psychiatric care so that he can't be pulled before the grand jury to testify. It's at that point where, as I'd referenced, they lean on the only 4 people willing to testify and offer testimony to the grand jury and get them to either recant their statements or they slap perjury charges on him. And now there's nothing left to investigate because all the witnesses have been disappeared or intimidated out. And so all you're left with then is the legislative committee of the state legislature that was also looking into it. And by the time he's out of psychiatric custody, which was obviously just a way of hiding him away, all of this is already blown over and he's back in the clear.
And again, this is another case of, shall we say, awfully convenient treatment, right? That this case, the witnesses go away, the defendant goes away, and when he comes back, healed ostensibly, right, from his psychiatric condition, well, it turns out the people investigating him are part of the same power network. Is that essentially what you're describing?
Yes, and that's exactly what I'm trying to get at here. Other people in other positions of power go and hide him away just long enough that they make the child abuse stuff disappear, and there's no further way to investigate it because law enforcement at the local, state, and federal level is already compromised and complicit in covering up his actions as far as that go. At that point, despite the fact that they're being smeared in the press, there's too much money missing to let him walk away, so they drop him on that.
So it's interesting because you have, should we say, a similar hypothesis that I do, when it comes to these figures and Epstein, right? That it seems to be, shall we say, individuals connected to the intelligence community. So I know that you've mentioned, the CIA explicitly, but do you think that it is only them, or do you see, more agencies as being involved in this?
Yeah, I think it's any one of them that can really get away with it or has a use for it. They are obviously the easy one to point a finger at because they're the ones who get caught doing the most nefarious stuff. But at the same time, you see local PDs or degenerates in local PDs protecting and running their own prostitution rings. You see it at the state level. And I have no doubt in my mind that Border Patrol, FBI, all the other ones get up to the same exact stuff. The only group that I would kind of put beyond reproach for behavior like this is probably the Marshal Service. And even that's a blind spot in my own thinking. But they're the most involved in actually fighting this stuff, it seems like. So I'm willing to give them a pass until I see something implicating them.
So do you think that there is some motivation other than the kind of utilitarian, like, blackmail? Do you think that there's something else driving it, or do you think that it's just a very, very good way to control powerful people?
The easiest answer is that it is, in fact, that easy to just control people using these systems. Like I said, even if they don't start out as a child abuser, you just keep offering them perks until they eventually take something you can use as this sort of sexual blackmail. You feed their hedonism, you feed their lust, their greed, and eventually you just suck them into this stuff. So, yes, I think that's obviously the main draw, and that's why intelligence funds and protects it like they do. But at the same time, it goes back to the question of, are there true believers? And the interesting thing about the daycare scandals, and Franklin in particular, is that some of the victims asserted that there was a satanic ritual aspect to this. And now, one of the other common threads running through the 80s was the 1980 release of Michelle Remembers, which was allegedly nonfiction or allegedly fiction, however you want to look at it. It's this account, this book about a little girl who goes through this satanic ritual abuse. And that's part of what turned normies against this, because that's what fired up the evangelical crowd, was the release of this book. And so every time you run into one of these daycare scandals, or the abuse network of the manager of the Franklin Credit Union, or all of these other things, you see, oh, well, this is just like that book, right? It's got to be fake. That's not how this works. And this is despite the testimony of psychiatrists and social workers who do understand how child psychology works, saying, no, there's something to this. This is not something that could be made up. There's too much specific detail in their testimony. But at that point, the well's already been poisoned, and it's so much easier to disbelieve it than believe it. And so that then provides the perfect cover for the true believers, because they already know, if I do this to these people, it's going to be too crazy to believe, right? It's like those stories you see on social media about Bill Murray, where he's stealing a French fry and tells the guy, but no one's ever going to believe you, though. It's that, except pure evil.
So, you spoke at the beginning about kind of your political orientation. So, do you believe that these networks of abuse, do you think that that is something kind of endemic to systems of power, or do you think it's something kind of uniquely like a horror of our age?
I think the way that it's been formalized, mechanized, and systematized is absolutely a consequence of modern society and the consolidation of state power. But I do think that it is probably mostly just a natural consequence of living in a fallen world and knowing that demons are, in fact, very real. You can go back and you can look at historical examples of this. You know, there's Gilles de Rais in France. There was the whole situation in Belgium, which is another show in and of itself. There's instances even in ancient Greece. Look at what their culture was. So, to answer your question, I think it's mostly this is something that's always been with us, but it's operating at an industrial level now where it hasn't in the past.
I think that that's a take that holds water. You know, one of the things that I'm, and this probably owes to my own confessional heritage, right? But I'm, uniquely convinced of kind of the awfulness of humans. You know, that we're quite capable of kind of, making hell on earth, wherever we go. But there is something kind of uniquely terrifying about the ability to kind of like mechanize, export, and coordinate that type of, like corruption. And it's interesting that you bring up, kind of this the idea of demons being real, because it's something I'm quite convinced of, and it's not necessarily like a rational, like a rational, I guess, like syllogism. It's not like I have observed X, therefore Y. But there is something to be said for the fact that it's like, okay, like if you believe that, good and evil exist, it's like, well, okay, like it kind of stands to reason once you've accepted that premise, that like, well, okay, like if that exists on kind of a cosmic level, right? Like it feels like it should kind of coagulate. And when you see these kind of like oddly religious, events cropping up over and over again, like wait, why does the Finders Group, why do they have an altar? Because it's a very religious symbol, and it's not just, I don't mean to trivialize it. These aren't just like greasy fat dudes who like child porn or whatever. There's something bigger than that. There's something more kind of deep and spiritual and ancient going on. Do you think I'm wrong in that?
I don't think you're even remotely wrong. And I've tried to avoid the lurid details too much because, frankly, I don't like discussing them. It's just hard to talk about. But you run into stuff with McMartin and with Franklin being the two in particular, where some of the victims and witnesses that were able to testify and were then charged with perjury have some of the most horrible stories to tell, specifically about rituals that they were forced to participate in, and most of it involving either inversions of Christian practices or just outright pagan fertility rituals, and the sort of debauching even beyond pagan practice of them. You know, it's a very common meme in some circles, including the ones I run in, to talk about Baal worship and feeding kids to the flames. But depending on just how much you choose to believe the witnesses and the victims, some of that might have literally still been happening. And we know that there's at least a parody of it at Bohemian Grove. And some people would allege that it's a real practice at Bohemian Grove. So even then, it's still ongoing, and these are still the symbols they use. And is it too much to think that some of these people are sufficiently lost to evil that with enough power and connections, they would act on these things? I don't think that's out of the question at all.
Well, again, it's like for a group of people who claim to have, no respect at all for kind of, Christian confessional heritage, they sure do spend an awful lot of time, mocking and degrading it, right? For something that's supposedly, completely unreal to them. So Dexter, we are coming up on time. Is there anything you want to say as we kind of bring this episode to a close?
Well, if you'll allow me to just toss one question back at you, you used a word that really piqued my curiosity there. You say confessional background. If it's not too much to reveal, do you mind telling me which tradition you hail from?
Oh yes, I picked that up from my friend Thomas as a turn of phrase. But I belong to a conservative Reformed Protestant tradition, so I'm essentially a very bad Calvinist.
I was wondering about that because I myself come from one of the confessional Lutheran traditions, and I really only ever hear confession used like that in my own context. But I was wondering just where you lied on that or lay on
Yeah,
that.
no, I'm one of the the vanishingly few Protestants on the radical right, and I'm not a particularly good one, mostly because I've made it almost somewhat of a meme on my show that I am almost singularly uninterested in inter-Christian theological disputes. I just uh,
They're just tiresome online, is what it boils down to.
it's that. And it's also like, well, okay, it's like on one hand, there's a guy who has a moderate disagreement with me about like, either church history or like, minute theological details. And on the other hand, it's like, oh, hey, this guy wants to sacrifice children to Baal. Who am I going to spend more time arguing with? It's a pretty easy decision for me.
So, in other terms, to wrap other things up, I'd recommend the original book on all of this, The Franklin Cover Up by John D. Camp. He was the lawyer to two of the victims and also the attorney for the state senator who led the investigative commission into the Franklin collapse. It's 400 ish pages and it goes into detail to all of the stuff I'm alluding to and trying to hustle through, and it's extremely well cited. There was a follow up book written called The Franklin Scandal. That's one of the touchstones of more modern conspiracy culture. And I keep referencing this case in particular because, as I've said throughout the show, it's the nexus, right? It shows you the child abuse blackmail networks, it shows you the money, it does show you the actual honest to God Satanism. And it ties all of these themes together in one place for people brave enough to believe that these power networks are evil and that they are trying to hurt us. So that's the recommended reading literature. I would personally be happy to discuss any of this stuff more in depth, whether it's with you or with listeners, but there's only so much time in a day to do it live on 1 hour of internet radio.
Yeah, that's pretty much my take on it, right? Which is that there's so much to go through here that you should view this as a primer, right? If this sounds interesting, go deeper. There's more here. Dexter is a great source for that. He did a show with Pete that's also quite good. And again, this should not be where you stop. So if my audience wants to find more of you, where should they look for that?
The best places these days are at Twitter or on Twitter at TLE Pause. You can also find me on the Timeline Earth podcast. I am an occasional weekly show guy, but I also drop several podcasts a month on their feed. So, you'll see 4 or 5 pieces of my content appearing on their podcast feed per month. So, Twitter, the Timeline Earth podcast feed. I have an additional podcast called The Gaslight Hour that releases every handful of months. It's extremely sporadic as my partners and I in that endeavor have wildly, wildly varying schedules. But
Well,
those are the primary sources.
again, and that's a hearty endorse from me. I'm relatively new to your work, but I find it fascinating. And as far as my stuff, you guys know where to find me. This show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Odyssey, wherever quality audio content is found. And if you want to support the show, you can do that either indirectly by visiting our sponsor Axios, so you can stop being a fat piece of shit, or you can do it more directly with all the links below. Again, do not depend on it, but always appreciate it. And again, Dexter, thank you so much for coming.
I really appreciate you having me. This was a lot of fun. I'm glad we got an opportunity to do something like this.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for your time. And to you guys at home, remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.